Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Changing Times in Boston's Wharf District. This evening's webinar will be produced or delivered by Liz Nelson-Weaver from the Friends of the Boston Harborwalk. My name is Alice Brown, and I'm the Planning Director at Boston Harbor Now. We work really closely with the Friends of the Harborwalk, and we're thrilled to be able to host Liz and all of you this evening. Liz is going to tell you more about the Friends of the Boston Harborwalk, but if you don't know about them, definitely take some time after this to learn more and find out how you can get involved. Liz typically does this as a walking tour, often on New Year's Eve day, and has adapted this so that for those of you who can't physically get to the downtown Boston waterfront right now, you can learn even more about its history than you would on a walk. And with that, I'm going to let Liz take it away.
Good evening and welcome to Changing Times in Boston's Waterfront, a webinar by Friends of the Boston Harborwalk. I'm just going to take 1 minute to tell you a little bit about our group. We are an all-volunteer nonprofit, Friends of the Boston Harborwalk, affiliated with Boston Harbor Now, also a nonprofit. And our mission is really very straightforward. We promote the public's enjoyment of Boston's 43-mile-long Harborwalk. We do it in 3 ways. The first is that we host monthly tours of different segments of the Harborwalk, most often in person, but now shifting to virtually. The second is that we facilitate harbor cleanups along the waterfront. And finally, we partner with property owners to add engaging interpretive signs along the full length of the Harborwalk. So tonight's webinar is on the changing times in Boston's Wharf District. And by the Wharf District, the wharves I'm going to be speaking about are Long Wharf, Central Wharf, India Wharf, and Rose Wharf that you can see here on this 1870 bird's eye view. I'm going to be using historic maps and images to highlight the major transition periods along this section of Boston's waterfront. All of Boston's waterfront has undergone extraordinary changes over the centuries, and I'm going to be speaking quite specifically about the ones right here in the Wharf District. So to begin with, I invite you to look at the 1711 map. But if you could bear with me, please, and ignore the vessels and ignore the houses. What I would like to talk about here are the land masses and the areas of flats that surround them. So to begin with, Nautilus Island, one of the 5 islands that now comprise East Boston. Charlestown to the north. What is now Boston was once a peninsula. And to the south, Dorchester Neck, which we now know as South Boston. But if you could take a minute to look at these dotted lines that extend far out beyond the upland areas, these were all known as flats. Typically between 1 and 4 feet of water at low tide, right up along the shore, of course, it would be mudflats completely. And for the Massachusetts people who would come here on a seasonal basis for centuries, they and their forebears, these flats were not an impediment in any way. They had upland areas cleared, and every year they would plant crops there. They would come here in the spring, stay through the fall. They used the salt marsh and the mudflat areas for harvesting shellfish. They navigated in dugout canoes with a very shallow draft, so it was easy for them to go from the shore out to deeper waters. They fished, they hunted, they took advantage of the extraordinary abundance of this area. For the settlers who arrived in 1630, however, these flats were an impediment, and I'll be talking about those in just a minute. So the first major transition, of course, that occurred here was with the arrival of the English settlers in large numbers beginning in 1630. One of the early things that they did was to put up fortifications. And the battery that you see in the foreground of this image stood pretty much where Rose Wharf now is. The first one was erected in 1666. It was expanded in 1740 and had as many as 35 cannon on it. And in the background, you can see a fort up on top of what was appropriately named Fort Hill. And we'll get back to Fort Hill later in the talk, but that is pretty much where International Place now stands in Boston. So what you're looking at here, of course, is a certificate of service for one Thomas Gardner, who served at the South Battery. There was a North Battery, which was over in the North End at what is now Battery Wharf. But it's when you learn about elements like this fort and the battery that all of a sudden names in Boston make sense. For example, Fort Point Channel and Battery March Street, which is right in the neighborhood. So going back to the map that I showed before, except looking at it even closer, the arrow is pointing at pretty much what is the Wharf District today. And this time, please do look at the ships, because of what you probably notice is that they are all at anchor, and they're all away from the shore at anchor, because again, they could not approach. It was too shallow for them to come in, except at peak high tide, and then, you know, loading and unloading would have to be done very quickly. The other thing I'd like to draw your attention to is just above and below the arrow, you see these thin lines extending. That was something called a barricado. It was another barrier, another defense mechanism to prevent ships from sailing right up to the harbor, except through a very narrow opening. So for the colonists, having these shallow waters surrounding all the upland was a real problem, because they depended heavily on the sea trade. It was really the core of the economy. It was at the heart of the economy. By the end of the 1600s, Boston had 200 ships coming and going, their own, that is, that were owned in the city, the town rather. So shallow waters for them were a problem, which they had definitely not been for the native people. And they needed to solve it. So they did, by building Long Wharf. They started construction in 1710. It took over 10 years to construct it. As the name makes clear, it is very long. It stretched almost half a mile out. And it was Boston's first deep water wharf. And it was a real game changer, because of course now ships could just come right up to the wharf, tie up, unload, load. Things were just so much simpler and easier and faster. So it was a really big deal for Boston to build this enormous wharf. The wharf and the street that extended beyond it, which used to be called King Street, we now know as State Street, really was the commercial spine of Boston. That was kind of the heart of business in the town. Tragically, a part of this commerce, in quotation marks, was the sale of enslaved people. And the place that this was most likely to happen in Boston at the time, in the 1700s, would have been on Long Wharf. This is one example of an advertisement. Another one from 1728 Boston Gazette, listing sundry European and East Indian goods lately imported, also Negro boys and girls, and Barbados rum. And in 1751, an advertisement for 5 strong, hardy men, most of them tradesmen. They could be inspected prior to their sale, again, on Long Wharf. The next major time of transition happened as a result of the Revolutionary War and Americans gaining independence. Because with independence, they were freed from having to adhere to British navigation laws, and they could trade with anybody they wanted to anywhere in the world. And very quickly, it became apparent that Long Wharf was no longer enough. It took a good decade or so for Boston to kind of come back from the depression that followed, the economic depression that followed the Revolutionary War. The town had been really badly affected by the whole experience economically, but bounce back they did. And by the early 1800s, it was clear that with sea trade having taken off once more, they needed another deep water wharf. And not only did they decide to build the wharf, but they added a whole new commercial neighborhood right here. They put in India Street, Broad Street, and the streets going across, and constructed buildings on it that they then sold and leased. And then, of course, India Wharf. So the construction began in 1804. It took 3 years, and Boston had its second deepwater wharf. On top of the wharf stood a quite extraordinary building. At the time, it was commonly referred to as the India Building, standing on India Wharf, but we more commonly now refer to it as the Bulfinch Building because of the architect, and that was Charles Bulfinch, arguably the most notable architect of the time in Boston, of course, famous for having designed the Massachusetts State House on Beacon Hill. It speaks to the prominence of sea trade and the prominence of the men involved in the sea trade and the investors who then built the wharf and the neighborhood here, that they were able to hire Boston's prominent architect to do their building. And here it is. It stood there for almost a century. The ground floor was essentially retail space. So it'd be places like cooper shops making barrels, ironmongers, barbers, grocers, anything and everything that would be useful for vessels coming and going and the sailors who manned them. The second floor was counting houses, they were called. And those were business offices, but I've always rather liked the name counting houses because it is so real. They were counting their goods as they came in, and they were counting their money and their profits. And then the top 3 floors were warehouse space. To have your office or your counting house at India Wharf was considered very prestigious. This was one of the places in town in which to show that you were making it and had made it. The building also housed 4 consulates at different times, the consulate of Belgium, Norway, Sweden, and Russia. The embargo of 1808 and the War of 1812 definitely sort of brought much trade to a standstill. It was not good for Boston, but the town did bounce back much faster than they had from the Revolutionary War. So that by 1814 or so, they were already talking about how, well, Long Wharf and India Wharf aren't enough. We need another deep water wharf. And so plans were made for Central Wharf, right in between the two. The construction began in 1815. It took a couple of years and included, again, this colossal long building stretching all the way to the tip of the wharf. Its layout was essentially very similar to the Bulfinch building, with retail on the ground floor, counting houses, and then warehouse space. It also included a fairly sizable auction room. So how busy was Boston Harbor that they needed all these deep water wharves? Well, in the 1820s, about 800 ships a year were coming from abroad. 2,000 or more coastal trade vessels were coming into the harbor. 15 to 20 years later, the average had almost doubled to 1,500 ships a year coming from abroad and more than 3,000 coastal trade vessels. So just an extraordinarily busy harbor. And what were they bringing and where were they coming from? Well, the China trade, which began in the early 1800s, was a really big deal. Much of some of Boston's old money is based in the China trades dating back to the 1800s. The big import, of course, was tea, but also porcelain and silk. Animal hides were coming from California and South America for the growing shoe industry in Massachusetts and New England. Wool from Australia and South America for the mills. Cotton from the South. So while slavery had ended in Massachusetts, the economy still was closely tied to the institution of slavery, with the cotton coming in through the harbor and then, of course, continuing on to the mills spread around Massachusetts and New England. Coffee was coming from Brazil, Cuba, and Haiti. Again, especially from Brazil and Cuba, Cuba likely dependent on enslaved labor. From the Mediterranean, fruit, wine, nuts, olive oil. Figs from Turkey. In fact, if you were buying figs anywhere in the country, they would have come through Boston. It was the only port through which figs were coming in. I have no idea why, but that was a fact. And from Russia and the Baltic states, hemp and iron. So just a cross-section of some of the goods coming in from all corners of the world. Another example of how prominent and important the sea trade was to Boston and the country, for that matter, was the construction of the Boston Custom House, which began in 1837. It took over 10 years to build it. It was the most expensive federal building in the United States at the time. 32 massive granite columns that came from Quincy, from the Quincy quarries. And I'd just like to draw your attention to the vessel on the left corner here, the bow and the bowsprit. And of course, you're looking at the seawall there. And this is this area between Long and Central Wharf. And you can see that the seawall was really right up close to the steps of the Custom House. That's where the waterfront was at the time. So building it where it's built made a lot of sense because ships could come right up to it. There was, of course, no income tax at the time, no sales tax. And so the import duties that were coming into Boston because of the incredibly active trade were very important both to the federal government and locally. So this image from the Boston Marine Society tells a good story and a bad story. The good story, of course, is that it's incredibly busy. There's lots going on, lots of people working, many vessels in town. Economy is thriving, things are good. The bad part of the story is that there are lots of vessels here. On the left, we're looking at Central Wharf, and on the right is Long Wharf, and it is very, very tight. It was difficult shuffling all these vessels around all the time. And by the middle of the 1800s, the ships were getting increasingly larger, and it was a problem. It looked like, in retrospect, having built Central Wharf where it was built may not have been such a good idea. And even today, when you're there on a busy summer day, watching the whale watch boat and the ferry and the cruise ships going out and the schooners taking people out for trips on Boston Harbor, you will often see the boats having to kind of juggle around each other. And so it's an ongoing issue now, but it certainly was very much so at the time. So around 1860, things began to shift in this area, in these wharves in Boston. Because of how tight the space was, But also the other major reason was that these wharves had no train access. They had no rail access. And increasingly, goods were coming in and being transferred onto trains as, you know, the way to get them inland and to other destinations. So these wharves not having rail access proved to be a big issue in terms of keeping them vibrant. Fortunately for Boston, there were other areas of the waterfront that did have excellent rail service. So in East Boston, for example, you can see these blue lines. Those are tracks coming right down onto the wharves. In Charlestown, again, train tracks coming right down onto the Hoosac wharves. And toward the end of the century, Fan Pier with extraordinary rail service, again, right down onto Pier 1, 2, and 4. By contrast, these downtown wharfs here, the Wharf District, so Long, Central, and India Wharf, you can see there's no track going out onto the wharves. There are tracks just north of that to the wharves in the north end, spurs reaching out. And there is that one blue line that you can see. There was a single track freight train that went there, but it was too little to really make a difference for the Wharf District wharves. Fortunately, because the other areas of Boston did have good rail connections, Boston did remain the second busiest port in the country through the end of the 1800s, but it was no longer happening in the Wharf District. It was happening elsewhere around the harbor. So to go back to the 1860s, when this next major transition began, a very early indication that things were changing was this plan. The plan was to put a road smack through the middle of the wharves. It was initially called Marginal Street. We now know it as Atlantic Ave. If you look to the left of the arrow, that's Central Wharf with that incredible long brick building that stretched to the end of the wharf and far back inland. The road was going to cut this wharf building in half. If you look to the right of the arrow, the same thing is happening to the Bullfinch building on India Wharf. It's about to be cut in half. The area just below the arrow, of course, used to be berthing space for vessels. It would be filled. And if you remember at the beginning of the talk, I mentioned Fort Hill, and perhaps some people wondered, well, where did the hill disappear to? Well, the hill basically disappeared into the water here. It was torn down and it was used as fill. That's what filled all the water areas inland of the new Atlantic Ave. The fact that there wasn't that much pushback from this plan speaks to the fact that everybody was sort of realizing that things weren't working as well at these wharves as they used to. And so essentially it was like, okay, well, fine, cut the building in half, reduce our docking space, because other parts of the city can take over. So while the 1860s spelled the beginning of the next transition, it certainly wasn't an immediate, quick change. It was a very slow but gradual decline over the course of really 90 years or so. And one of the things that did stay fairly busy along these wharves were packet lines. So packet lines were ships that went to specific destinations, and usually just one, and on a fairly regular basis, weather permitting. It could be as close as a packet ship to Cohasset going from Long Wharf, and as far away as Australia, leaving from India Wharf. Although fairly quickly, the packets that were leaving from the Wharf District wharves began to specialize in coastal trips, so East Coast trips. They were no longer going abroad. It was companies from other wharves who handled the international shipping lines. One of the most successful ones was Eastern Steamship Lines that you can see here in the ad in the middle, and it'll show you the coastal points that they were going to. The company was in business well into the 20th century. So again, perfectly successful, just a very different kind of business along the waterfront. A lot of what they were carrying was passengers, because this was still a very convenient place for people to come in Boston. If they lived in the city or very close by, to get to the waterfront here was easier than, say, to get over to East Boston. But a definite shift from all the goods that were coming into these wharves in earlier decades. Just a bird's eye map from 1879, and you can see the New Atlantic Ave is in place there. You can see, if you look at Central Wharf, how the rest of the building exists back here, but it's been cut in half. Indian Wharf, I honestly don't quite know whether that is still a part of the Bullfinch building left on the other side, or whether that's something different, but certainly a much shortened Bullfinch building standing on India Wharf here. But things look okay. I mean, it's not a depressed area. There are vessels coming and going. It's nothing like the busyness that we saw on that image earlier in the 1800s. But there are ships coming and going. Just to draw your attention to this ferry that's coming into Rose Wharf. It began running in 1875. It was one of the 3 ferry lines that ran between either the Wharf District or the North End, connecting to East Boston. And this particular one from Rose Wharf, and his example of one of them, went over to East Boston, where the shipyard now is, the boatyard in Jeffreys Point. And there people could hop off the ferry onto a narrow gauge train and go up to Revere Beach, or beyond that to Lynn if they wanted to. In the summer in particular, it was an extraordinarily popular trip to cross over by ferry and to hop on the little train and zip up to the beach for the day. So in the early 1900s, there was an elevated trolley and that ran along Atlantic Ave and then continued on Commercial Street through the North End. Part of what it connected was North and South Station. So while we now often talk about trying to find some public transportation connection between the 2 stations, it did once exist, and in fact existed for almost 40 years. That is not to say that I'm by any means advocating that we put an elevated trolley line between the 2 stations, but it is kind of interesting to think about the fact that it was once here. What it also did, though, was that it did sever the downtown from the waterfront. It was one of the first things that kind of divided the city here. On the left slide, you can see that is actually the old Rose Wharf building. There used to be a trolley stop here. So in fact, people could take the trolley car to Rose Wharf, then the ferry, then the narrow gauge train up to the beach. And on the right side, you can see that single line freight train, the Union freight train that used to run along Atlantic Ave and provide some service to the North End wharves, although not so much for the wharves down in the Wharf District. So another aerial view. This time we're seeing fewer boats, but larger boats. So of course, right in the foreground, we can see a fairly good sized vessel tied up outside of Rose Wharf. Another one right next to Central Wharf, but really leaving no space for anything else anywhere to be tied up there. And yet another along Long Wharf. So it's not depressed. It's certainly quieter, but everything's intact. The buildings are up. It's looking all right. If you look to the left here, and again to the right, you can see that elevated trolley track running along Atlantic Ave. And of course, there we have the Custom House Tower. So in 1913 is when the tower started to be built on top of the existing Custom House. So it wasn't separate from it, it just went right on top. It took a couple of years to build, and for several decades, it was the tallest building in Boston until the old John Hancock building was built. By the middle of the century, by the 1950s, 1960s though, this area of Boston's waterfront really hit bottom. It was the nadir. So that decline that began in the 1860s had kind of bottomed out at this point. Boston had decided that they would build a 6-lane elevated highway, which you can see in the background there. If the trolley track severed the downtown from the waterfront, the highway certainly sort of put the exclamation point to that. Along the bottom there, you can see Atlantic Ave, this weird wedge of buildings squished there in the middle. Custom House way back here. And then, of course, look at the wharves. Rose Wharf, India Wharf, Central Wharf. The buildings are gone, torn down. The wharves are falling apart, especially India Wharf, which is, you can sort of see the end of it is just kind of dilapidated. And they were used for parking lots. That's all they were good for. It was not an area of town that you really would want to walk around, certainly alone and certainly at night. It was just pretty bad. So Boston took action. They really wanted to do something about their historic waterfront. And a series of plans were discussed, and finally a waterfront redevelopment plan was put in place. The New England Aquarium was encouraged to build on the end of Central Wharf. Harbor Towers went up in 1970, 71. It was the first large residential buildings, because it's 2 towers, to be constructed anywhere along the waterfront. It was built with a combination of federal money and private investment. Long Wharf Marriott was built. And finally, the beautiful Christopher Columbus Park. So the waterfront was definitely beginning to look different. This photo, by the way, is taken from the Custom House Tower observation deck. But it was really 2 enormous investments of public money that finally transformed the waterfront in the Wharf District. On the left, of course, you see an older photo still showing that 6-lane highway, the central artery, cutting through town. That was torn down. The Big Dig project, as we all know, put the traffic underground into a tunnel and opened up the area between downtown Boston and its downtown wharves. And the other huge investment, of course, was the harbor cleanup. The harbor had become one of the dirtiest harbors in the country. And as a result of the harbor cleanup toward the end of the 20th century, it is now one of the cleanest harbors in the country. There's a state-of-the-art water treatment processing plant out on Deer Island. These digesters are part of it. The virtually clean water is pumped many miles out to sea in Massachusetts Bay, and some of the more solid material is converted into fertilizer pellets and shipped down to Florida to fertilize the orange trees. So it was really our tax money put toward these two projects that finally transformed the Wharf district. So in the left slide, you're looking at part of the Greenway Park with Rose Wharf Hotel, the Rose Wharf building, which includes the Boston Harbor Hotel, offices and condominiums right behind. To the left, of course, one of the harbor towers. But this spectacular series of parks that stretches down the middle where the elevated highway once ran. And to the right, again, those parks continuing up through the north end, culminating in the Zachem Bridge. Of course, there's a custom house to your left. And just to draw your attention to a building here, next time you're walking around the Greenway or in the vicinity of the custom house, you'll notice on Central Street, there is a small block of brick buildings. If you're looking at it from the Greenway, you're looking at the Granary restaurant there. That is what remains of the long brick complex, I guess you'd call it, that stretched all the way to the end of Central Wharf that was built in 1815. It's really nice to walk around it. I mean, it's beautiful architecture. It gives you a feel for what used to stand all the way to the end of the wharf here. And if you stand alongside it and just picture what that must have been like for it to stretch all the way to the end of where the aquarium now stands, it's really quite extraordinary. And if you walk around both Broad Street and India Street, you'll notice there are several of those brick buildings that were constructed in 1804 or 5 still standing. And once you recognize one with its 3 or 4 stories, it's brick, you'll quickly recognize the others as well. So there are elements of the early 1800s construction that still remain along the waterfront. But the area once again has been completely transformed. It's gone through so many different stages and now is extraordinarily vibrant with residences and hotels and restaurants and drawing hundreds of thousands of people every year. Hopefully more and more as we all feel safer being around each other 6 feet apart with our masks on. But it really is just a beautiful part of the city and draws many, many people every year. So with that, I'll end my talk and I welcome your questions.
Hello, everyone. I know that many of you figured out how to use chat earlier when we had some technical difficulties. You can now use the chat to pose questions to Liz. Again, you can write to everyone or just to the panelists, and I'll see them and pass those questions on to Liz. While we're waiting to get some questions in, oh, here we go. Cameron asks if there are any archaeological artifacts that have been discovered in the wharf area during its transformation, if you're aware of any.
There definitely were during the Big Dig project. Whether they were specifically in the area of the Wharf district, I don't know. But there were all kinds of quite extraordinary findings of Native American artifacts as well. And I believe they are on display at the Massachusetts Archives on Columbia Point, but I'm not positive. But there's certainly a booklet about them and you can find information online about them.
Great. Erica asks if you can talk about the impacts of rising, she says water levels, I'm guessing that's sea level rise, and how that affects the district.
Well, it certainly affected us 2 years ago in March of 2018, where there was some really high tides and then a storm surge on top of them. And I think the flooding that occurred, especially on Long Wharf, uh, really accelerated Boston's climate resiliency plans. So there are ongoing discussions and public forums and all kinds of plans underway for how to try to protect the buildings and the park and everything else from the rising sea levels. So the Boston Climate Resiliency Plan is very active and is really thinking about lots of different ways and try to mitigate it. And one of them is to be raising the Harborwalk, which stretches all around the edges of the harbor, and to use that in part as one way to counter.
Yeah. And for those of you listening at home, I do believe the city will be releasing that plan in the next few months, the downtown North End Climate Ready plan. So more on that to come soon. Tom picked up on your thread of saying, there's a reason that things are named what they're named. And he wonders if you know where the name Battery Wharf came from.
From the North Battery that was there.
Great. Trisha asks if there are slides about the Harborwalk. Trish, I don't know if you're looking for images of what the Harborwalk looks like today, or if you want to find the Harborwalk in general. You can go to bostonharborwalk.org and find a map of where the Harborwalk exists. Liz, I don't think you have any specific slides in your slide deck right now, right?
No, I don't think I do.
Yeah, so Trish, you can go exploring on bostonharborwalk.org.
But just to give you a sense of where it is in terms of the images that we're looking at, just right on the other side of the hotel there, on the other side of Rose Wharf, and on the other side of the towers, the Harborwalk runs right along there. And it's a beautiful walk all around Central Wharf, up to the end of Long Wharf. You can go for miles.
Yeah. As many as 43, depending on who you ask. Mark, this is a history tour. I'm going to ask your question and give Liz the option to not answer it. Mark asks, what is your feeling about the proposed Chiafaro Tower in place of the Harbor Tower's garage with respect to harbor access?
This is probably not the venue to get into that, but thank you. It's a great question.
I thought so. Magdalena asks if you can talk a little bit about the origin of Chapter 91 during this time of wharfing out. Were there any regulations that would have shaped that?
That's a terrific question. I would need to go back to all kinds of older notes to really be able to give you a clear, coherent answer on that. I believe the original Chapter 91 was written toward the end of the 1800s and then underwent dramatic changes closer to the end of the 20th century. But I would need to be better prepared by going back and reading all my materials to be able to give you a really good answer to that. Sorry.
Magdalena, I can connect the two of you if you guys want to work on finding the answer to that question together. Catherine asks if Faneuil Hall is connected to the wharf system. I know that was built in an area that was originally where people were bringing, that was the town dock.
Right. So the interesting piece about the Faneuil Hall building is that on the far side of it, the side that faces Government Center, if you look down on the ground there, you can see a line etched in the pavement, and that is Boston's original shoreline. In terms of 1630, when the English settlers arrived, that's where you had dry land regardless of the height of the tide. So it gives you an incredible sense of how much land has been filled between there and today's waterfront.
Great. Liz, you're getting a little scratchy. Maybe we can just take down your slide if you're done with slide share,
Okay.
and that might help clean up your voice. Fabulous. Again, this is a little bit outside of the district, but Kanan asks if there are plans for developing other wharves like Fisherman's Wharf or the World Trade Center in the seaport.
Fisherman's Wharf, I think there's a strong feeling about trying to keep it as is, as a Fisherman's Wharf. The World Trade Center being Commonwealth Pier, there are all kinds of very large plans to completely redo the public space around the building that are underway. And I don't know exactly what the timeline is, but I think we first read about it maybe a year ago, but there are going to be really significant changes on Commonwealth Pier.
Yep, Kanan, you can check the BPDA website for more information on that. They've got all the approvals up. Mary Jean asks when Boston started dredging the harbor and where, in the Wharf District or just the Central Channel?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't know when they started dredging. I turned to my husband, who shook his head no, he doesn't know either. Sorry, I have no idea. My guess is they were probably doing it fairly early on. They were just sort of enterprising, hardworking, we can make this happen kind of people. And great question. I have no idea. I have a sense of when they started to fill things, but I don't know when they started to dredge.
Yeah, you need a certain kind of boat before you need the dredging. So
yeah,
I don't know what that boat was, but I'm sure there was a point. Brian asks when Quincy Market was established and what was there in the time of the wharves.
I don't know what year it was built. I think it dates back quite a bit, but I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think it's 1820s, Brian.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So
I think it was iterative, right? They're like filling and they're wharfing and they're filling and they're wharfing.
Right. So 1820s would, sort of be at that period where these wharves were extraordinarily active, and hence the need for probably that kind of large marketplace there.
Great. Cameron asks if you can describe the process that ships and the goods they contained underwent when they arrived in Boston. Where did the goods go? How were they processed? What did that look like?
It's a very good question. I haven't looked at that at all. I couldn't answer that other than in general terms. And of course, it would depend so much on the time period that you're talking about and what materials there were. So sorry, that's almost like a book long answer, but there has to be a book out there somewhere about it, but I don't know what it might be. I do know that at one point, because the wharves, these wharves here had such bad train connections, they actually floated barges over from Fan Pier, barges that had tracks on them and freight cars on them, and they unloaded fruit in particular that would come in onto Long Wharf. They unloaded it directly from the ship onto these freight cars that were on the barges, and then they would be taken over to the Fan Pier, connected to the rail, to the rest of the tracks, and off they went. So it was a pretty complicated process, but it also gives you a really good indication of why these wharves went into decline, because it was such a complicated process. But I'm sorry that I can't give you a much better answer about the bigger question.
We've got some interesting questions. Some of them are people who seem to think that you just know everything about the whole way around the harbor. So
definitely not.
Although for those of you watching at home, Liz does a lot of the research for the interpretive signage that you might find cropping up around the harbor. So she does know a lot, even if it's not the answer to your amazing niche questions. Charles asks if you know anything about the granite stones that seem to be lying in the harbor. Like as you sort of like walk along, there's like sort of granite blocks in different places.
Well, some of them would have been part of the seawall, most likely. There is actually somebody in our group, Scott, who is a granite expert, and one of our tours is about the different kinds of granite along the waterfront. He did it a year ago, May, and I'm sure is itching to repeat it as soon as we can have tours in person. So he would definitely, Scott Kruger, come to one of our meetings or email our chair, Mike Manning, and he can put you in touch with Scott, who can tell you everything you ever wanted to know about granite.
Great. I'm appreciating the questions that are coming in. People are saying thank you and adding other things. Someone suggested that 1826 might be the year that Quincy Market was completed. Brian asks if the Battery Wharf and Rose Wharf were the north and south batteries. Were they the limits of the city at the time that they were established?
Well, they weren't the limits of the city, but they were protecting sort of the heart of where the commerce was and where most people lived. Would have been, you know, in those very early decades, it would have been between those two batteries. So yes.
Great. Someone else asks, Robbins, India Wharf was considered to be the wharf for luxury items. Do you know what other wharfs took in?
You mean what other goods came in at other wharves?
Yeah.
Well, the goods that I listed weren't just for India Wharf. Those really were for India Central and Long Wharf along that whole stretch. So exactly how they divided up, I wouldn't be able to tell you. I do know that there were several China trade merchants who had their counting houses at Central Wharf and at India Wharf. But, and of course, a lot of fruit came in at Central Wharf and at Long Wharf. But other than that, I don't really have it divided up wharf by wharf.
Great. We've got a few thanks, including one from Anne and another one from Cameron. Tom asks about when Logan Airport got built and where the landfill came from. And Tom, I'm going to say that's a Google question, as there are many, many phases of how Logan Airport got built. And I'm guessing Liz doesn't have every date for the iterations of that memorized. But definitely worth checking out. Formerly an island, now an airport.
Yeah. And it is by far the largest landfill to happen. The largest land making project was for the airport, the second largest being in South Boston, but that was the largest.
Great.
And actually, if anybody who wants to know everything there is to know about land making in Boston, I would recommend Nancy Seashaw's book, Gaining Ground. For many of us, it is the Bible of land making in Boston. If you want to know what was filled, when, where, and how, it's in the book.
Great. I will endorse that as well. Great works by Nancy Seashaw's. We're coming up at 8 o'clock, and I want to thank everyone who joined online tonight to participate in this conversation and the great questions you've been able to add. The next tour that the Friends are doing is a virtual tour that looks at films that have gone around the edges of Boston Harbor. That'll be led by the chair of the Friends group, Mike Manning, and we'll have more information for you about that online. It'll be on Eventbrite, just like this one, and it will be in the Boston Harbor Now e-news. If you want to learn more about the Friends, you can go to bostonharbornow.org/friends and learn more about what the group's up to, upcoming tours, how to get involved. Most of the answers are email Mike Manning. So with that, it's 8 o'clock. I'm going to thank you all for coming. We hope to see you at a future tour. And if you could give a virtual round of applause for Liz, I'm sure she would love to know that you are all at home applauding. I will give her an actual
Thank you all for
applause
joining
right
us.
here. Thanks and have a great night.